Okay. Hi. So welcome everyone to the fourth live session. So yeah, these are some important links which are always there in the presentations. I think by now you know what they mean and how to find out where they are. So today for week 4, we'll be dealing with the module ecological energetics, which consists of food chains, food webs, and trophic levels, primary production, and also the nutrient cycle. And in the next week, we'll look at the next module, which is population ecology. So we'll start with ecological energetics. So in the first lecture, Sir taught us about food chains, food webs, and trophic levels. So we'll take a look at them. So basically, the transfer of energy in the form of food from its source in plants through herbivores and carnivores or detritivores or decomposers present in the ecosystem is referred to as the food chain. So basically what this means is that the grass or plants or trees, which are basically the primary producers of um, energy and food. Um, so basically they take energy from the sun and use that to synthesize food in the form of carbohydrates, which are then basically eaten by the primary consumers, such as grasshoppers, and then on by other organisms such as grasshoppers are eaten by birds, and birds are eaten by snakes, and snakes are then eaten by hawks or eagles, and basically they all once they die and they are like present as dead and decaying matter in the soil, they're fed on by decomposers such as mushrooms and other fungi, and they're broken down into small nutrients that are then again absorbed by plants from the soil. So this basically chain is of organisms, and how food and energy flows through ecosystem is basically known as a food chain. So there are a lot of definitions that we came across. So we'll go through all of them. So the first distinction is between organisms that are present in the food chain. So organisms in the food chain can either be autotrophs or heterotrophs. So autotrophs are basically the organisms that are responsible for primary productions, also known as producers. So they basically use inorganic elements or inorganic uh, energy sources to produce organic material, such as plants using light energy and converting it into organic matter. And other such examples would be trees and algae. And heterotrophs are basically organisms that cannot produce their own food, and instead they rely on uh, intake of nutrition from other sources, such as plant or animal matter. So basically, heterotrophs are most animals that basically feed on other animals or other plants, and they don't produce their own food. Right. Uh, So autotrophs are again divided into two you broad classes based on how they basically uh, manufacture these organic molecules, like based on what they use to manufacture these organic molecules. So photoautotrophs, here basically photo means light, auto means self, and troph means nourishment. So basically a phototroph is an organism that uses light as a source of energy to for its own nourishment, like self-nourishment, right, to manufacture organic molecules. And so examples would be most plants and algae. Chemoautotrophs are basically here. Chemo means chemical, and again, auto means self, and troph means nourishment. So chemoautotrophs are basically organisms that are using chemical reactions as a source of energy to manufacture organic molecules and food. So an example would be this bacteria that's found in deep sea hydrothermal vents, which basically uses so things such as sulfur that come out from the vents to create food, basically sulfur and methane and all that, instead of using sunlight. So, yeah, we have been talking about producers and consumers. So basically, here are a few more definitions. So producer is basically an organism in the food chain that makes its own food. So, for example, autotrophs such as grass, plant, tree algae. Consumers are basically organisms that consume other animals for food, such as grasshoppers, frogs, python, etc. Any of the animals that most of the animals that are generally found around. So consumers can be of different types. So basically, we have primary consumers, which are organisms that only consume the producers. So, for example, grasshoppers only consume the producers, which are grasses. A secondary consumer is an organism that consumes the primary consumer. So, for example, frogs. In this example, frogs consume grasshoppers, and thus they are the secondary consumer. Then we have tertiary consumers, which are organisms that consume the secondary consumer. For example, snake here, the python here is consuming the frog. So the python here is a tertiary consumer. And then a quaternary consumer would be an organism that consumes the tertiary consumer. For example, a hawk that feeds on the snake or python. Okay. Again, like based on their eating habits, animals can be divided into various different classes. So herbivores are basically organisms that eat only plants. So they are generally present as primary consumers. So for example, cows, goats, sheep, and all. Carnivores are basically organisms that eat other animals. So they are generally found in the secondary, found as secondary, tertiary, or quaternary consumers. So, for example, tiger, lion, hyena, etc. And omnivores are basically organisms that eat both plants and other animals. So they are generally found as secondary or tertiary consumers. An example is bear or human. And decomposers are basically organisms that convert dead material that is present in the soil. Uh, Basically, they break it down and recycle the nutrients that are present in the dead material by giving it back to the soil. Decomposers include two classes of organisms, so detritivores and microorganisms. Detritivores generally consume detritus, such as decomposing large parts, pieces of decomposing plant and animal matter, as well as feces, and make it more exposed to microbial decomposers, such as bacteria and fungi, which further break it down. So detritivores can be organisms such as earthworms, which basically break down these larger uh, pieces of decomposing plant and animal material into smaller parts that can then be acted upon by microbes such as bacteria, mushrooms, and fungi. So, does anyone have any questions till now? So, so the food chains can be divided into two broad types. So basically, we have the detritus food chain, which starts from detritus and goes through detritivores into carnivores. So, for example, in mangrove forest, we might have fallen leaves of mangrove plants, which are acted upon by detritivores, such as earthworms or um, other such organisms. And basically, these detritivores are then consumed by other, let's say, detritivore consumers, such as small fish or insect larvae. And these are then consumed by other smaller or larger fishes, which are then finally consumed by um, piscivorous birds. So, piscivorous birds are basically birds that eat fishes. Mm. So here we move from start from detritus, which is eaten by detritivores, and then progress to other carnivores, which are basically consuming the organisms that are present below them in the food chain, right? Or before them in the food chain. The other food chain that you can have is called the grazing food chain, where which generally starts from a plant base and goes through herbivores to carnivores. So basically, you start from a plant that is eaten by a primary consumer, such as a goat or a sheep or a cow, and then those are then again eaten by secondary consumers or carnivores, such as like lions, tigers, and so on. So this grazing food chain can again be of two types or two kinds. So they can either be predator food chains or parasitic food chains. So predator food chains, so both predator and parasitic food chains share the fact that they start from a plant base. So there's a primary producer, and then it goes through herbivores and then carnivores. Right. So the predator food chain basically, an example of that would be the food chain containing grass, which is eaten by cheetah, and cheetah, which is eaten by tiger. So basically here, the cheetah is predating on the grass and the tiger is predating on the cheetah and so on. So the size of organisms generally in predator food chains, as we move up the chain, so we are moving from grass to cheetah to tiger, the size of the organism tends to increase because the organism is consuming the organism that is present below them. Right. Uh, on the other hand, in parasitic food chain, so here basically we have omitted the grass part here, but you can still add like grass, which is eaten by rat, or something which is eaten by rat, and then basically flea, which are present on the rats as parasites or pests, and parasitic protozoa that are again present on the flea. So basically, in this parasitic food chain, since basically the organisms that are present as parasites on the host, so as we move up the chain, the size of the organisms tend to decrease as compared to the predator food chain, where the size tends to increase as we move up the chain. So here the main differences between the grazing food chain and the detritus food chain. So the primary source of energy for the grazing food chain is sun, which is used by the primary producers and then by herbivores and carnivores. The primary source of energy for the detritus food chain is the detritus, that is the dead and decaying plant and animal matter that is present in the soil, or organic matter that is present in the soil. In the first trophic level of the grazing food chain, we have herbivores, whereas in the first trophic level of the detritus food chain, we have detritivores. The other thing is, generally grazing food chains are very long chains, whereas the detritus food chains are generally shorter chains, composed of very few trophic levels. Yeah. Mm. Okay, so we talked about food chains, but uh, in nature, what happens is it's everything is not very linear. So, for example, one thing that we uh, saw earlier was that let's say grass is eaten by grasshopper, then which is so basically grass which is eaten by grasshopper, which is eaten by a frog, and then which is eaten by an eagle. So this is one single food chain. But uh, the grass can also be eaten by other organisms such as mouse. And the eagle can, apart from eating frogs, can eat other organisms such as mouse and snake. Right. Snake can eat a mouse and like deers eat trees and so on and so forth. So instead of having a linear or a circular single food chain, what we generally have in nature is basically called a food web. So basically, there are these large interconnections between a lot of different organisms that are present in the ecosystem based on who eats what. Right. So basically, if we are going to define it properly, a food web is a system of interlocking and interdependent food chains. So basically, each of them can be a separate food chain. It's just that they are uh, crisscrossing and interlocking with each other. So there are organisms that are present in both of them, and so on and so forth. And the other important definition that uh, we need is basically what is a trophic level. So a trophic level is basically one of the hierarchical levels in an ecosystem that consists of organisms that are sharing the same function in the food chain and the same nutritional relationship to the primary source of energy. So, for example, uh, here, so this is basically called a trophic pyramid. So you have a pyramid-like shape where basically you have these primary producers as the first trophic level. So in the ocean. So for example, phytoplankton and seaweed. So basically, these are organisms that share the same function in the food chain. So they are both primary producers and the same nutritional energy to the primary sources of energy. So they both utilize the primary source of energy, that is sun. So basically, they are present in the same trophic level. Then, once we move one step up in the second trophic level, we have herbivorous consumers such as zooplankton and cockles. So basically, these are herbivorous consumers. So they have the same function, which is eating the primary producers, and they have the same nutritional relationship with the primary source of energy. So they are two steps away from the sun, both zooplankton and cockles, which are then eaten on the third trophic level by uh, carnivores such as small fish, jellyfish, as well as crustaceans and all, which are again eaten by larger fish in the next trophic level, which are eaten by squids, let's say in the fifth trophic level. And finally, the top carnivores are the apex predators of the ecosystem, such as sharks, dolphins, and albatross, eat all these organisms that are present below. Okay, so basically what we saw here is ecological pyramid. So ecological pyramid is basically a graphical representation designed to show the uh, biomass, numbers, or energy at each trophic level in a given ecosystem. It is also called as the trophic pyramid, or the Eltonian pyramid, or the energy pyramid, or the food pyramid. Right. So we have basically three kinds of ecological pyramids that we can get. So the first one is a pyramid of numbers, which is basically contains the number of organisms that are present at each trophic level. So the information that we get from the pyramid of numbers is that how does the number of organisms change as we move from one trophic level to the next. In the pyramid of energy, instead of number of organisms, we have what is the energy contained in organisms at each trophic level. Right. And for the pyramid of biomass, we have what is the biomass of all organisms that are present in a given trophic level in an ecosystem. So this is how the pyramid of numbers looks like. So basically for a grassland ecosystem, we might have plants such as grasses and herbs, which are basically fed on by mice. So there might be a large number of individuals of these plants or grasses, but the number of mice that can feed on them will certainly be lower than that. Then the number of snakes that can survive on this population of mice, the number of snakes that can survive on this number of mice will also be less than that, because one snake might need to eat more than one or two individuals of mice. And again, for the same reason, the number of eagles that we have in the uh, ecosystem might be less than the number of snakes that are present in the ecosystem. So as we move through the different traffic levels, so from primary producer to primary consumer, secondary consumer, tertiary consumer, what happens in the pyramid of numbers is that the number of organisms tends to decrease as we go up the traffic levels. However, we can also have cases where we have an inverted pyramid of numbers. So basically what happens here is as you go up a traffic level, the number of organisms tends to increase. So, for example, producers here can be trees, which are then fed on. So, basically, we have these birds which feed on the leaves and fruits and seeds of these trees. So, they are the first trophic level, which is the herbivores. Then these birds are uh, like parasites on them. Basically, so bugs that reside on the birds, which are basically using the birds as their host. So the number of parasites on a given bird might be more than one. So therefore, the number of parasites overall for the population of birds might be greater than the number of birds, number of individuals of birds. And again, for the same reason, we have hyperparasites, which are parasites on the parasites that are present on the bird, such as fleas, which basically might have the highest number in this scenario. So what we have here is an inverted pyramid of numbers, where the number of organisms increases as we move up the trophic levels. We can also have a spindle pyramid of numbers. So a spindle shape is basically something like this, which basically increases and then decreases. So when we look at a tree ecosystem, so let's say we have one big tree. So here on the bottom part, we have one, and there might be a lot of insects that are surviving on that tree. So the number of insects might be greater. So on the second trophic level, which is the primary consumer, we have a very high, large bar. Then there might be a fewer number of birds that might be surviving on these insects. And again, when we move up, there might be even fewer large birds that can survive on this population of small birds. So from the second trophic level onwards, it's decreasing. But from here to here, it is increasing because one big tree can have a lot of insects. So this is called a spindle pyramid of numbers because it looks like a spindle. It has a tapering top and bottom. We can also have a dumbbell shaped pyramid of numbers. So depending on what all organisms you are using to make your pyramid, food pyramid or ecological pyramid. So for example, here we have grass, which is the producer, which is present in ample number in the environment. Then we have rabbits, which are primary consumers, which feed on the grass, and they are basically present in lower number because they need a lot, each individual needs a lot of grass to survive. On the other hand, we have flea, which is a parasite of rabbit, which is present on the rabbit, which might be present in larger numbers because one rabbit might have more than two or three fleas. So overall, the number of fleas that we have in the population will be more. So here we have a dumbbell-shaped pyramid of numbers, where basically we, which basically looks like a weird dumbbell. Right. Next, what we have is the pyramid of energy. So basically, the pyramid of energy tells us how much energy is present in each trophic level. So, for example, so there's something called the 10% rule, which we'll look at in much more detail later on. So basically, what it tells is it tells us is that approximately 10% of the energy that is present at a lower trophic level is transferred to the next higher trophic level. So basically, let's say we have a ecological pyramid like this, where we have in the first trophic level, we have, so ignore this part. In the first trophic level, we have producers such as cyanobacteria, phytoplankton trees and all. So they might be getting 100,000 joules of energy from the sun, okay, or from some chemical reaction. So they are then fed on by primary consumers, which might be herbivores. So when it moves from this first trophic level to second trophic level, the amount of energy here is basically 10% of what it was. So this is 10,000 joules. Then again, when we move up one more step, so when we reach secondary consumers, they might just have 1,000 joules of energy in their body, whereas tertiary consumers might have 100 joules of energy, and apex predators may just get 10 joules of energy. in their body by eating the organism at the lower trophic level. Okay. So the other thing we have is the pyramid of biomass, where basically, since normally the numbers would here decrease. So for example, let's say we have grass, which is eaten by, let's say, this deer and rabbit, which are eaten by this fox, which is then hunted by the lions and stuff. So in this case, the number of individuals of grass will be much high. Number of individuals of these will be lower and lower and lower as we saw before. Along with the number of individuals, the biomass, so basically the amount of grass per kilometer square, let's say. So if you take 1 kilometer square, how much amount of grass do you find? So let's say you find 1,000 kg of grass. So if you take that same area and you find out how many deers and how many rabbits are there, and you weigh all of them, you'll find that there might be around 100 kg of biomass in that trophic level. So shared among basically deers and rabbits. Then as we move up the trophic level, the amount of mm, biomass that is present keeps on decreasing. So this is known as the pyramid of biomass. We also have an inverted pyramid of biomass where the biomass might increase as you go up the trophic levels. So this happens for a marine ecosystem, for example, where uh, you might have phytoplanktons which are eaten by zooplankton. So a lot of uh, zooplankton can survive on a smaller population of phytoplanktons because they have a greater rate of reproduction. So as soon as they are eaten, they are also getting replaced. So the population does not change a lot, but it gives a lot of food for the zooplanktons. So the population of zooplanktons is much larger. So the biomass is much larger. Then these are eaten by smaller fishes, which might be even bigger than them. And these are eaten by larger fishes, which are probably the biggest ones in this uh, marine ecosystem. So once you take all the small fishes and all the large fishes and you weigh them, you basically get the biomass of them. Then you get this inverted pyramid of biomass, where basically as you move up the trophic level, the biomass tends to increase. Okay. Does anyone have any questions till now? One second. Okay. So there are a few more definitions. So now we'll take a look at ecological efficiency and all those things in a bit more detail. So basically, we have two definitions here. A standing crop is basically the total dried biomass of the living organisms that are present at a given trophic level. And ecological efficiency is basically the efficiency with which energy is transferred from one trophic level to the next. So it can again be divided into a lot of different types. So we have a lot of different efficiency that we can calculate. So first we have exploitation efficiency. So which is given as the amount of food ingested divided by the amount of prey production. Right. So how much are you able to exploit the prey? So how much of the prey can you catch and eat? So for example, this is denoted as IN divided by P n minus 1, where IN is the amount of prey that is ingested in the nth trophic level, and Pn is the amount of prey that is present in the n minus 1th trophic level, so the one below that. Similarly, assimilation efficiency is given by the amount of food assimilation divided by the amount of food ingestion. So basically, how much of it goes into your body versus how much of it you ate. So this happens in the same trophic level. So basically, assimilation in the trophic level divided by ingestion in the same trophic level. We have gross production efficiency, which is basically the uh, amount of consumer production divided by the amount of ingestion. So basically how much you are able to produce divided by how much you ingested. So this is basically the production at the same traffic level divided by ingestion at the same traffic level. And the other one is net production efficiency, which is basically consumer production divided by amount of assimilation. So here we have PN divided by A in the same traffic level. So ecological efficiency is then given as the um, multiplication of exploitation efficiency multiplied by the assimilation efficiency multiplied by the net production efficiency. So basically, uh, how much are you able to exploit the prey? So how much of them are you able to catch? Assimilation is how much of what you catch and eat are you able to get? And net production efficiency is basically from whatever you assimilated, how much are you able to produce? How much biomass are you able to produce? Right. So therefore, the formula for ecological efficiency is basically figured by multiplying all three terms. So you see that mm, basically these things will cancel out, and what we are left with is basically Pn divided by Pn minus one, so which gives us the ecological efficiency. So the 10% rule, as we were talking about earlier, basically says that during the transfer of energy from one traffic level to the next, only about 10% of the energy gets stored as biomass. So the remaining 90% of the energy is lost during the transfer, might be lost due to incomplete digestion, so thrown away as fecal matter or urine, and it might be broken down in respiration so that you can carry out your own activities. Right. So, for example, let's say you have grasses and you basically have a grasshopper, which basically feeds on the grasses. Right. So a grasshopper might eat, let's say, 1 kg of grass in a month or in a week or something. Right. So of that 1 kg, some of it will be used basically for it to look for grass and to hide from predators and to perform its daily activities like moving around and jumping and flying and all that. So those will be consumed by the process of respiration. So some amount of the energy that is present from that is derived from this 1 kg of grass will be lost. Some of it will be lost as like body heat or things like that. Some of it will be like thrown away as fecal matter. So basically, the amount of energy that the grasshopper gets from this 1 kg of grass might be very less compared to what energy is actually present in that 1 kg of grass. Right. So the only thing to remember is that at each traffic level, it's 10%. However, the efficiency of plants in capturing the sun's energy is only about 1%. So when you go from the sun to, let's say, grasses or plants, here you have the 1% of energy that is absorbed. And after that, for herbivores and for carnivores and all that, you have 10% energy that is possible. So, for example, if 100,000 joules of energy from the sun was intercepted by the grass, then the grass has um, basically the grass gets this much energy from the sun, but it is able to assimilate only 1,000 joules, which is basically 1% of that. Then the 1,000 joules, when a grasshopper eats grass, it's only able to assimilate and use and basically use and store up to 100 joules. Then a frog which stores up to 10 joules, snake which is 1 joule, and hawk which is zero point 0.1 joule. So it keeps on decreasing by 10% as you move up a trophic level. So a general formula for this might be, so considering that um, plants or primary producers are at trophic level 1, we can figure out the energy at trophic level n by the energy intercepted from the sun divided by 10 to the power n plus 4. Basically, uh, here what we have is, let's say, 100,000 joules of energy intercepted from the sun by the grass. Then for the grass, which is at level 1, the energy would be 100,000 divided by 10 raised to the power 1 plus 3, which is 100,000 divided by 100, which is 1,000. Right. That's what we calculated with. Then if you wanted to know at the trophic level of, let's say, snake. So this is 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 trophic level. So for snake, what will it be? Divided by 10 raised to the power 4 plus 1. Basically, 100,000 divided by 1. So which is what we have here. Okay. So another thing that is important while discussing about trophic levels, food chains, and food webs is something called the trophic cascade. So basically, a trophic cascade is a ecological phenomenon triggered by the addition or removal of top predators and involving reciprocal changes in the relative populations of predator and prey through a food chain, which often results in dramatic changes in the ecosystem structure and nutrient cycle. So, for example, let's say in an ecosystem, you have a lot of plants, some deers, and some wolves. So let's say what you do now is basically you remove all the wolves. So what happens is since the wolves are hunting on the deers, so the population of deers is now not in check because there's no one hunting them. So the population of deers keeps on increasing, and so basically what happens is, so wolf population is decreasing, population of deers is increasing, and since the deers eat the grasses or the trees or herbs, so the population of this grass will keep on decreasing because there are more and more deers that are feeding on. So the grass that you might find might not be more, might be more patchy, or the trees might be more eaten or more destroyed because there's more number of deers. So basically, these are known as reciprocal changes because at each trophic level, it's kind of flipping. So when we go from here to here, the number of deers are increasing. But when we go from here to here, the number of grass or plants is decreasing. Now, let's say we had a longer chain, then basically it will alternate every trophic level when we are going down and down. So sometimes these things, such as like removing the top predator or something, or adding a top predator, leads to huge changes in populations and ecosystem dynamics, which can lead to major changes in ecosystem structure. For example, when people introduced wolves in the Yellowstone National Park. So what happened was basically these wolves then, so because there were no wolves or apex predators, the deers that were present in the national park were quite a lot, and they were eating a lot of the grass and shrubs. So after the wolves came in, they put a check on the deer population, and as the number of deers decreased, but they also led to basically behavioral changes in the deer. So basically what happens is the deer is now avoiding areas where it can be easily caught. So in those areas, the amount of grass and trees and shrubs tend to increase. And basically this led to a lot of different other organisms coming and inhabiting these areas and led to a lot of changes in the ecosystem structure and the population of organisms. And finally, through various effects, through various cascading effects or like additive effects across the food chain, it people were able to link the addition of wolves to the changing of stabilizing of basically rivers or changes in courses of rivers in that area. So these kinds of um, sudden changes such as addition or removal of top predators can cause drastic effects on the ecosystem because of changes through the food chain. And these effects and these changes are basically known as a trophic cascade. Okay, so we are done with the first lecture. Does anyone have any questions? Okay, great. So we'll move on to the second lecture where so I talked about primary productivity, primary production. So basically, we are basically revisiting some definitions and looking at some new ones. So autotrophs are basically organisms which are primary producers. Examples are trees, plants, and algae. And primary production is basically the process of synthesis of organic compounds from atmospheric or aqueous carbon dioxide through photosynthesis or chemosynthesis. So basically, what is happening here is organisms are synthesizing organic compounds such as carbohydrates and other things by using carbon dioxide that is present in the atmosphere or that is dissolved in the water. Okay. So this process is known as primary production. So plants form 99.9% of the Earth's living matter or all living organisms, and they are the primary source of energy for almost anything and everything on Earth. So basically, they are the primary plants in these algae and photosynthetic bacteria and all. Basically, the mm, primary source of energy for all the other organisms and living beings that are present in the ecosystem because they have the unique capacity of converting solar energy into organic compounds and bioenergy. And that basically is what drives the energy in the food chains and food webs in different ecosystems. The third important thing is that primary production or the process by which organic compounds are produced using carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and from the oceans or from aqueous sources is basically it releases oxygen as a byproduct. And oxygen is uh, one of the most important gases that we need to survive on the planet because almost all organisms respire using oxygen, and that is what they use to break down organic material to or food into smaller compounds and release energy for their day-to-day. So, in a plant, two different processes at any given time are happening in tandem. So, the first thing is photosynthesis, where basically light is used to synthesize light or solar energy is used to synthesize uh, carbohydrates by, by using atmospheric carbon dioxide and water. So basically, in the presence of chlorophyll and other enzymes, solar energy is trapped by plants, and these carbon dioxide and water are combined to produce carbohydrates such as glucose and release oxygen as a byproduct. On the other hand, respiration is the other process that goes on in plants and all animals, which is basically the breakdown of these glucose and other carbohydrates by metabolic enzymes into again carbon dioxide and water that we respire. So basically, these two processes are happening in tandem in plants and in animals. Almost always we have the respiration and not photosynthesis. Um, So these are basically the major processes that drive how energy um, is used and stored and converted uh, across the ecosystem. There are three more definitions. So the first is gross primary production, which is basically the energy or amount of carbon that is fixed via photosynthesis per unit time. So basically how much energy is fixed via photosynthesis by a given plant per unit. by given patch of area of sun. Net primary production is basically energy or carbon that is lost via respiration per unit time. Right. And compensation point is basically the equilibrium point for plants where photosynthesis equals respiration. So let's say we have a graph like this, where we have the time here. So it starts from 0, which is midnight, to 6, 12, 18, 24, which is again midnight of the next day. So basically, respiration is going on always at some constant rate. So basically, this is what we have. So rate of basically this respiration. And then photosynthesis happens only in the presence of sunlight. So let's say the plants start photosynthesis somewhere around 6 or 6:15, and then it ends when the sun is setting somewhere around 6 in the evening. Right. So this is basically photosynthesis. Okay. So this rate of, it can be the rate of carbon dioxide or oxygen produced, right? Because that is basically the rate of these reactions. So here we have basically three zones. So in the first zone, based on the intersection points of these two lines, we can have three zones. In the first zone here, we have more amount of carbon dioxide release than oxygen release because the plant is respiring more compared to photosynthesizing. In the second part here, we have more amount of oxygen release because photosynthesis is more compared to respiration. And here we have more amount of, again, carbon dioxide release because uh, respiration is more than photosynthesis at night. And these 2 points, where basically these two uh, rates of gas exchange in these processes are equal, are basically known as compensation points for plants. So how do we measure how much energy is produced or uh, basically utilized by plants or produced by plants? So one way we can do this is by measuring the amount of gas, that is the amount of oxygen or carbon dioxide that is released by the plant. So we have the equation here that 6CO2 plus 6H2O in presence of chlorophyll and solar energy gives rise to C6H12O6 plus 6O2. And we know that this basically absorbs 2966 kilojoules of energy. So that much of energy is absorbed or stored by the plant. Each time 6 moles of oxygen is basically produced, or 6 moles of carbon dioxide is basically utilized. Okay, so basically what we can do then is basically measure how much carbon dioxide was there in the air before, then how much carbon dioxide is there in the air at some other time t, after some time has passed. And basically, we see what is the difference. And based on that and the ratio that 6 moles of carbon dioxide will be equal to like almost this 2966 kilojoules of energy. So if we calculate the number of moles of carbon dioxide that was utilized by the plant, we can get at how much energy is produced or stored by the plant in the form of carbohydrate. The other methods, the other method would be one other method would be radioactive isotope method, where basically we place uh, radioactive carbon, so radioactive labeled carbon dioxide. So here it has a C14 molecule um, instead of C12. And after some time, the so basically in the surroundings of the plant, we replace the normal carbon dioxide with the radioactive isotope of carbon dioxide. And after that, after some time, the complete plant is harvested and the quantity of radioactive carbon is measured to estimate the amount of carbon dioxide that was observed in the plant at that given moment, like in that given period of time. The issue with this is that some amount of radioactive carbon may also get lost during distillation. So what you get here is not the rate of photosynthesis, but what you get here is basically the net of photosynthesis and respiration. Mm. Another way in which we can measure primary productivity is known as the harvest method, where basically we calculate the biomass at some time t, and then again calculate the biomass of the plant material at some time t2, so t1 and t2, and we basically take the difference. So b2 minus b1, b2 is the biomass at time t2, and b1 is the biomass at time t1. So b2 minus b1 will give us the amount of plant material that is produced by the plant. And this is known as the harvest method. Now, here, in terms of primary production, we can calculate two efficiency values. So first is the efficiency of gross primary production, which is basically energy fixed by the gross primary production divided by energy in incident sunlight. So how much of the energy is present in the sunlight versus how much of the energy is fixed by the gross primary production or photosynthesis. And the second is efficiency of net primary production, which is energy fixed by net primary production divided by energy in incident sunlight. So how much energy is fixed by net primary production, which includes both photosynthesis and respiration, and versus how much energy was incident via sunlight. The, productivity is defined as basically production of something divided by time. So we can have net primary productivity of primary producers. So net primary productivity is given as basically APAR into LUE, where APAR is basically absorbed photosynthetically active radiation. So how much of the radiation is actually absorbed photosynthetically by the plant multiplied by the light use efficiency. So if that much amount of light is absorbed, how much amount of carbon can be produced using that much light. So basically, for APAR, you have something like in this amount of area, let's say 1 meter square area, how much sunlight is incident per time, right? At a given time. That is your APAR, absorb photosynthetically active radiation. And LU is basically light use efficiency, which is given as basically how much grams of carbon is basically produced by 1 millijoule of energy. Sunlight. Okay. So basically, apart from all these methods where we measure the primary productivity, net primary productivity, gross primary productivity, we can also estimate these things by using satellite data. So NASA and all major like space research organizations have these satellites. ISRO also has satellites which basically transmit light at different wavelengths and then get at what signal is coming back from the ground. And based on that, they can have these maps of basically chlorophyll concentration and then use some equations to basically get at what is the net primary productivity or the gross primary productivity. So basically you have data of land use cover and other things such as CO2 concentration and all that. And you basically build models based on these data. So you go to a few places where you measure all these things and you correlate that with the satellite data and then basically improve on your model and make predictions for other places through modeling. Uh, the other question that arises is what all things does productivity depend upon? So productivity is given as a function of 7 variables. So the first is the solar constant, which is basically the rate at which energy reaches the Earth's surface from the sun. It is usually taken to be around 1338 watts per meter square. The second thing is the latitude, because if you are, let's say, at a lower latitude or close to the equator, you will get more sun than compared to a very high latitude or towards the pole, because you will just get slanting rays of sunlight and less amount of sunlight. And the sunlight has to pass through a larger area of the atmosphere to reach you. Right. The other thing is cloudiness. If it's very cloudy, you don't get a lot of sunlight. Uh, Along with cloudiness, the amount of dust and water in the atmosphere might affect how much of sunlight is penetrating to the bottom of the forest or the surface of the earth. Uh, and other things such as arrangement of leaves in plants and the area of leaves, are they large or small, and the concentration of carbon dioxide are things that basically affect the productivity. Okay. So based on productivity, we have different kinds of lakes. So the first kind of lake that we have is called a oligotrophic lake, which is a lake with very low primary productivity as a result of very low nutrient content. So these are generally characterized by low algal population and often very clear waters with high drinking water quality. So this is, for example, Somorini, which is present in Ladakh, which is a oligotrophic lake, because the water in this lake comes from the glacier, which does not have a lot of nutrients. The second kind of lakes that we have are exotrophic lakes. So basically lakes which have an intermediate level of productivity. These lakes are often clear water lakes and ponds with beds of submerged aquatic plants and medium levels of nutrients. Okay. So there's not a lot of algal bloom, but there's a healthy amount of aquatic plants and some animals present in the lake. Now, eutrophic lakes are lakes with very high biological productivity due to excessive concentration of nutrients, especially things like nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. So basically, when humans dump waste or sewage or something into lakes or ponds, those lakes and ponds generally tend to be eutrophied, or they change into eutrophic lakes because due to the excess amount of nitrogen and phosphorus and all that present in the sewage and other wastewater plants, uh, other wastewater, there's a lot of algal bloom and algal growth, which basically takes the lake into. Then we can also have another case of hypereutrophic lakes, where basically it is hypereutrophic lake is a extremely nutrient-rich lake, which is characterized by frequent and severe nuisance algal blooms. So basically, you have so much algal blooms that they're creating a nuisance, and there is very low transparency and very low oxygen levels in the lake or pond, because they are often um, all the oxygen and all is basically often used by the algae, and they often create basically these dead zones beneath the surface because there's not a lot of nutrients or oxygen for other organisms to survive. So the top part might be algal blooms, but inside that, in the river, most in the river or lakes, most of the things might be dead. So one example of this is the Potomac River, which is found in US. So basically, based on other things, you can make these different trophic classifications of lakes. So, for example, This trophic index, chlorophyll and phosphorus, the amount that is present in the lake. So this is basically chlorophyll and phosphorus concentrations. And we have the Secchi depth. So the Secchi depth is basically a measure of transparency or turbidity of water body. So basically what they do is they have a disk which has four quadrants. Two of them are black, two of them are white. Okay, so these two are white. Now this disk is basically lowered into the water column or water body. Okay, and basically till when you can differentiate between these white and black um, parts of the disk, that the maximum depth in which you can differentiate between them is called the Secchi depth. Basically, if you can differentiate between the white and black parts of the disk for a very long depth or a very um, high depth, that means the water is much more clearer. And if the depth is less clear, where you can stop distinguishing these two segments of the disk, that means the water is much more turbid in that area. So oligotrophic lakes generally have um, very low amounts of chlorophyll and phosphorus and a very high Secchi depth, which might be greater than 8 to 4 meters. Mesotrophic lakes generally have moderate amounts of mesotrophic and mesotrophic lakes generally have moderate amounts of chlorophyll and phosphorus and moderate Secchi depth for 4 to 2 meters, whereas eutrophic and hypereutrophic lakes will have very high amounts or concentrations of chlorophyll, phosphorus, and basically very low Secchi depth, which can range from maybe 2 meters to, let's say, for hypereutrophic lakes around 50 to 25 centimeters. Okay. So we talked about nutrients and lakes and all that, but where do these nutrients come in the lakes and in these water bodies? So basically, the first thing is uh, rivers bring a lot of sediments. So rivers, when they flow from upstream from mountains into the plains. So what they do is they carry rocks, which are then broken down on the way. And basically they carry other small sediments and soil particles, which basically act as nutrients when they're deposited as the rivers flow slows down as it approaches the plains. The second thing might be bird droppings, which so piscivorous birds which feed on fish and all might be flying over these water bodies and like um, defecating on them. So these bird droppings are rich in nitrogen, and these might be another source of nutrients. The other thing is basically um, dust clouds and all, which basically transfer some nutrients from the atmosphere to the oceans or water bodies. The major other thing is upwelling of oceans. So basically, what happens is in the ocean, you have around, let's say, this much zone where light penetrates, and after that, it's all darkness, right? So there's not a lot of activity going on here and the water present here is colder and might have more salinity because more amount of soil and other um, salt and other soluble substances might be depositing at the bottom near the bottom of the lower layers of the ocean. So basically, the amount of the kind of water that is present here might be more might have more solutes and nutrients, but it is not accessible by these uh, basically organisms that are present in the light zone where most of the activity of the ocean is carried out. Sometimes what happens due to some natural and otherwise things, these lower parts of lower layers of water tend to come up. So this is known as upwelling of the ocean. And this brings a lot of nutrients and other uh, basically solutes and solvents that may be present in the lower parts of the ocean onto the top, where it can be used by these basically photosynthetic plants and algae and all other organisms. Right. So why is knowing about these like lakes, these sources of nutrients and these different productivity things important for us. So we can basically use these knowledge that we have about different uh, nutrients and organisms to our benefit by modifying ecosystems according to how we want, or according to things that might benefit us. So, for example, in 1974, these researchers showed that uh, phosphorus plays a very large role in algal blooms. So what they had is these very long, basically very big lake where they where it's divided into two parts. You can see here two different colors. Okay. So in basically this part, there's a lot. They put nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Whereas in this part, they just put nitrogen and potassium and no phosphorus. Okay. NK, this is NPK. And they realized that after some time, this whole part was full of algal bloom, whereas there was no algal bloom in this part, where even when these two parts are connected. Right. So basically, what they realized was phosphorus is one of the important nutrients that basically creates algal blooms, and thus, if we only contain the amount of phosphorus in the in water bodies, it might help us prevent algal blooms. Right. The other thing is like, so this is again about another limiting resource. So in the ocean, um, this is by organization query. So basically, SOIRI is the full form is the Southern Ocean Iron Release Experiment. So in the Southern Ocean, what they did was they wanted to test if like iron is the limiting resource that is preventing productivity. So what they did was in going around in the ship, they put iron around these lines around these places. And when they took out like satellite images and tried to measure the amount of chlorophyll concentration, they saw that the chlorophyll concentration was much higher in places where artificially iron was added. So one of the use cases of these things might be that we might be able to put iron into the ocean to increase the productivity of the ocean at certain places so that it basically absorbs a lot more of the carbon dioxide that is present in the atmosphere, and thus the ocean can act as a carbon sink, whereas decreasing the amount of carbon dioxide present in the atmosphere, and thus preventing or helping us mitigate global warming. Right. So knowing knowledge of these limiting resources and how they affect ecosystems and other functions of ecosystems helps us engineer or basically develop ideas that can basically help us um, deal with other problems. Right. So that's it for the second part. Does anyone have any questions till now? Feel free to ask. If not, we'll continue. So next, in the third and the final class, so I talked about nutrient cycles. So a nutrient is basically a substance that is used by an organism to survive, grow, or reproduce. Like we can have different kinds of nutrients. So generally, nutrients are broken down into two different types. One is macronutrients and the other one is micronutrients. Macronutrients are generally nutrients that are needed in much larger amounts in the body. Uh, so these generally include primary nutrients such as nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, which are generally used for like making structural organic compounds such as DNA, proteins, and all that, and secondary nutrients such as calcium, magnesium, and sulfur. Micronutrients are nutrients that are, or like trace elements are basically nutrients that are needed in small or very low trace amounts. These generally include boron, copper, iron, chlorine, manganese, zinc, and molybdenum. So we are talking about producers here, plants, in most of the cases. So how do we define if a nutrient is basically essential for a plant, right? So elements or nutrients that are essential must meet these three criteria. So the first is in the absence of the element, the plants should be unable to complete their life cycle. So, for example, in the absence of, let's say, nitrogen or calcium, a plant will be unable to complete its life cycle. The second is the deficiency of an essential element cannot be met by supplying some other element. So you can't find a replacement element that can work instead of the element that you're talking that the plant is deficient in. Right. And the third thing is the element must be directly involved in the metabolism of the plant. So we'll look at some essential elements that are generally used up by plants. So the first is nitrogen, which basically is used to create proteins, nucleic acids, vitamins, and hormones, which are used for day-to-day stuff. Then we have phosphorus, which is again a constituent of nucleic acids. It is very important as it is present in ATP, which is basically the currency of the cell or the basically packets of energy. So ATP is converted into ADP and so on, broken down into ADP and so on, and releases energy in the cell. The phosphorus is also present. So phosphorus is present as phospholipids in the cell membrane, which is basically the boundary between the cell and everything else. And it is also found in certain proteins. Potassium is basically needed to maintain the turgidity of the cell and cation anion balance. So basically, depending on the number of cations or positive ions and anions or negative ions that are present in the cell and the amount of solute that is present in the cell can take up some amount of water or can lose some amount of water. And that basically changes the rigidity or the basically what do you say? So if you have a cell which is basically like this, which has lost a lot of water, it will become very flaccid, very soft. But if you have a cell which has a lot of water intake due to osmosis and a lot of solutes and all that, then it's basically the cell is basically more stronger and more stout, which is known as basically turgidity. So potassium helps maintain the cell turgidity and the cation anion balance in the cell. Calcium is basically uh, used to create the cell wall in plants. So plants, even after like plant cells, after the cell membrane, they also have a cell wall, outer covering, which is basically made of cellulose and calcium pectate. Right. And the calcium is also used in a lot of different calcium channels in the cell membrane, which help the cell and basically signaling, cell signaling and stuff. Magnesium is an important element and essential element because it is a constituent of chlorophyll and it helps in the activation of respiration and enzymes. And sulfur is also an essential element because it is a constituent of amino acids such as cysteine, methionine, and also constituent of several vitamins and coenzymes. And basically, here's a list of micronutrients that are derived from air and water. So carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen are derived from air and water in the form of carbon dioxide, oxygen, and water. Primary macronutrients such as nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium are generally uh, taken up by plants in the form of soluble salts from the soil. Secondary and tertiary macronutrients such as sulfur, calcium, and magnesium are also taken up by the soil, from the soil by plants, mostly. Right. And here is a list of micronutrients that are generally needed by plants. So basically, all of these nutrients that are needed by plants and animals to survive are basically present in limited amounts in the uh, atmosphere or in the soil, right? So once they are used by the animals and plants, they can't be used by other plants and animals. So there must be a way for these nutrients and elements to be cycled back into the atmosphere and the soil. So this basically these cycles are known as biogeochemical cycles. So basically, a biogeochemical cycle is a pathway in which a chemical substance moves through the biosphere and lithosphere, atmosphere, and hydrosphere compartments of the Earth. So basically, this is how basically the carbon cycle describes how carbon moves through the biosphere, lithosphere, atmosphere, and hydrosphere. The water cycle describes how water moves through all that. Nitrogen cycle describes how nitrogen moves through all that, and so on. So this is basically a generalized view of a nutrient cycle. So we have the sun, which basically gives out light, sunlight, which is used by producers to make food. The producers then basically, along with sunlight, they take up nutrients from the nutrient pool, nutrients such as carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and so on. Right. Then these producers are eaten up by herbivores, and when they die, I'm sorry, eaten by herbivores, herbivores are eaten by carnivores, and when all three of them die, they are decomposed by decomposers. So the dead and decaying matter, which are decomposed by decomposers and detritivores, are then again fed back into the nutrient pool in the form of inorganic salts or basically gases and stuff like that. Right. So now we'll take a look at some few biogeochemical cycles. So for example, here we have the nitrogen cycle. So basically nitrogen is present in the atmosphere as N2. So that is probably nitrogen is the most abundant gas in the atmosphere, right? So there are some nitrogen fixing bacteria which can basically convert this nitrogen into ammonia NH3. Right. Then there are other bacteria called nitrifying bacteria, which basically convert it into nitrates and nitrites. Uh, these are then these nitrates, and other soluble forms are then taken up by plants and also denitrifying bacteria. Some of these nitrates and nitrates are lost to the atmosphere by denitrifying bacteria. Once plants assimilate nitrogen and nitrates, they are eaten by animals. And basically, these animals then, by the process of amplification, convert it into ammonia and dump it back into the soil. And basically, we have a cycle where nitrogen is moving around from the atmosphere to the biosphere to the lithosphere. Right. And lightning is another major driver which basically produces nitrates and nitrites from atmospheric nitrogen. So nitrogen fixation is basically the conversion of atmospheric nitrogen into ammonia. There are three major ways in which this occurs. So first is biological fixation, which is basically done by the nitrogen fixing bacteria and all. Second is lightning, as was shown here. And the third is industrial fixation, which is not shown in this above cycle, but we'll talk about it more. So biological nitrogen fixation is basically the conversion of atmospheric nitrogen into ammonia. So bacteria such as these the rhizobium, which are symbiotic bacteria living in the nodules of leguminous plants, and other microbes like Azotobacter, nostoc, and Anomina, basically have these enzymes called nitrogenase, which basically can convert nitrogen into ammonia. So that's how biological nitrogen fixation occurs. Ammonification is basically the production of ammonia through decomposition of organic nitrogen in dead plants and animals. So dead plants and animals are then, by the process of ammonification, converted into ammonia by decomposition. Nitrification is basically oxidation of ammonia to nitrates and nitrates. So here we basically saw that ammonification and these ammonification and these nitrogen fixing bacteria basically produce um, ammonia, and these are then converted by these nitrifying bacteria into nitrates and nitrates by the process called nitrification. So basically, these bacteria are basically chemoautotrophs. So they are using this equation. So ammonia or nitrate plus oxygen to give rise to nitrate and nitrite is basically the equation that they are using in the raw materials that they are using to gain energy. They are not using sunlight, instead they are using this ammonia and nitrate. Right. Now, industrial nitrogen fixation occurs because we as humans have figured out a way to produce ammonia and nitrates and nitrates as artificial fertilizers for our agricultural plants and stuff. So we have two processes called the Haber process and the Ostwald process. The Haber process basically uses atmospheric nitrogen to and atmospheric hydrogen to produce ammonia. And then the Ostwald process uses this ammonia to produce nitrates and basically nitric acid and nitrates, which are basically then used as fertilizers and stuff. Right. So the next cycle that we'll discuss is called the carbon cycle. So there are three major pools of carbon. One is present in the atmosphere. So carbon is present as carbon dioxide. There is carbon in rocks, and there is carbon in ocean water in the form of CO3 or carbonates and stuff, or dissolved carbon dioxide. So carbon from the atmosphere can dissolve with carbon in the ocean water to move into the ocean pool, and by evaporation it can move into the atmosphere pool. Uh, Atmospheric carbon, by the process of weathering, can go into rocks, and by tectonic movement, these rocks can then release the carbon out into the atmosphere. So these are all like the abiotic parts. And the biotic part comes here. So basically, carbon in the atmosphere is taken up by plants or phytoplankton by the process of photosynthesis to convert carbon dioxide into uh, basically carbohydrates or organic material. These are then consumed by other basically secondary consumers and all that. Right. Uh, Respiration is a process that basically converts some of this organic carbon that we have in our body into um, carbon dioxide that is released into the atmosphere. Decomposition also produces some carbon dioxide. Lithification is basically sediment, like basically these dead and decaying organic matter getting compressed and forming rock-like structures. So basically fossil fuels and stuff. So that's an example of lithification, where basically these organic matter or organic carbon is converted into fossil fuels, which are present deep in the crust of the earth. When these fossil fuels and other stuff are burnt, any kind of combustion basically releases carbon dioxide. Any kind of conversion of like hydrocarbons or organic matter basically produces carbon dioxide, which is then again released into the atmosphere. You also have the water cycle, where basically water transfers from the atmosphere to rivers and water bodies to underground and to organic like biosphere. So basically, water that is present in oceans and water bodies are basically evaporating into the sky or atmosphere. this water that is evaporated or then comes down in the form of condensation or precipitation onto the earth or onto rivers and all. And here, basically, plants take up this condensation or water to, for their use, basically. And some of it is also transpired by the plants, right? Um, we call it process of transpiration and respiration. So most of the water that falls on the earth kind of infiltrates into the lower parts of the earth, so like the bedrock and all, thus reaching the groundwater reservoirs that might be present in a place. Some of the water that falls onto the land also runs off to like rivers and streams just by flowing. So basically, this is known as the water cycle, where water is getting cycled continuously between the different spheres of Earth. And we have the phosphorus cycle, where basically rock phosphates are basically broken down into soil phosphates, which are taken up by plants, or due to rain, they get washed out to water bodies, and then basically to the ocean and stuff. And then they again basically settle down or sediment at the bottom of the ocean. And basically, they're again converted into rock phosphates there. So once these plants take up these phosphates, they have transferred into animals and other living organisms by consumption. Then once all of these plants and other organic matters are dead, they are basically decomposed by microorganisms and detritivores to again convert these phosphates that are organic phosphates into soil inorganic phosphates, which might be, which are again found like given back to the soil for utilization by other plants and animals. We also have a sulfur cycle where basically a lot of things are happening. So we have volcanic emissions which produce sulfuric ash. We have basically emissions from the oceans. If there's a lot of sulfur dioxide in the atmosphere, it comes down in the form of acid rain or sulfuric acid rain. Then, sorry, basically things like fossil fuel consumption and other emissions also um, basically lead to um, emission of and deposition of sulfuric dioxide and sulfates in the atmosphere, and they again come back in the form of acid rain in different places. So they can also be transported from land and ocean by clouds. So these acid rain clouds, basically. So this is known as the sulfur cycle. So basically, we now know about all these cycles. So why do we need to read about all these cycles and all these stuff? So that we can understand how we impact these also. So we'll talk about some impacts that human intervention, such as deforestation, might have on these biogeochemical cycles and available nutrients, because the amount of available nutrients in a given area or a given place, geographical location, basically determines the kind of ecosystem and the amount of organisms or animals that might be present in that given area. Right. So the nutrients will in the end determine what is the ecology or the different amount of organisms and different animals that are found in a given area. Right. So here is one example from a paper where first they describe how rainfall happens in a forest and what all happens to the water that is falling into the forest. So basically, when there is rainfall, so basically this is like in brief the water cycle in a forest. So if there is rainfall, some of the rainfall might directly fall into the bottom of the forest by not passing through any, by not touching any trees or shrubs and all. So that might either overflow from the top of the mm, surface, or that might infiltrate in beyond into the deeper layers and might move into the mm, deep groundwater and all groundwater reservoirs. Uh, there might during the rainfall there might also be small drip of water from the plant leaves. So some of the water might be trapped in the plant leaves and then flow or drop slowly onto the ground, uh, where it's captured in the leaf litter and all also. Some of it might flow in on the stem of the plants. Then once these plants are um, like growing and respiring and transpiring, basically, they take up water from the ground via their roots, and basically by the process of transpiration, they basically lead it out onto the atmosphere. Also, if there is water in the ground or on the surface of the forest by evaporation, it will also go into the atmosphere. So these are the major processes that happen. So what they basically found is that if you cut down a forest, so stand age is basically what is the age of the forest in years. So zero is where they cut down the forest, so there's deforestation. And on the y-axis, we have the average annual yield. In this is the average annual basically rainfall, right, or amount of water. So basically, we see that initially the amount of oh, sorry, this is not amount of rainfall, but the amount of runoff. So average annual runoff. So how much of the water is basically runoff is basically how much of the water is basically flowing or overflowing into streams and all. Right. So you see that initially the amount of runoff or the amount of water that is flowing in the streams decreases as you cut down forests. And after some time, like let's say around after 20 years, 20 to 30 years, it reaches the peak depression of the lowest point. And after that, it slowly recovers over a long period of time. So let's say around 100 or 150 years. Right. Now, why does this happen? Why is there a decrease here when we are doing deforestation? So what they figured out, so basically this thing is called a Xerac curve. So this thing here. So what they figured out is basically that if the stand age of a forest is very low, let's say around 15 years or 30 years. So the amount of overstory transpiration that is happening is quite high, and the amount of runoff that is happening is quite low because the plants are still growing and they are utilizing the water, and they need the water in the different parts of their plant to basically build and grow and basically grow in height and reproducing basically all that. So basically, that's why they need a lot more transpiration or uptake of water. Whereas as the forests mature, in the stand age basically increases, let's say around 60 to 120 to 240 years. So basically, what happens, plants no longer need that much amount of water because they are not growing anymore, but they are just replenishing whatever is getting lost. So they need a lot less water, and therefore there's a lot less transpiration that's happening here. And more of the water here in these like older forests is generally uh, going as the runoff. So they're basically not being used by the plant and they're just going off as runoff. Okay. So this explains why as stand age increases, the amount of runoff increases and the transpiration kind of decreases. Right. But the other thing to notice is that in the initial case, the understory transpiration is less, but the understory transpiration tends to increase because as forests mature, they have more clearly defined levels of like canopy. So the top level in the understory and lower story are basically much more defined, and more plants are coming up in the lower stories as the forest is aging. So the understory transpiration tends to increase a bit. Yes. The soil or letter evaporation and the interception are basically almost the same across everywhere. Now, other things that happen when we do deforestation is this is from another paper where they basically have like these hills and they have these like basically watersheds here and they have forests here on the hills. So in the valleys they have watersheds where water is collected. And what they did was so they have like many watersheds. So here we have 6, 4, 2, and so on. So in watershed 2, they cut out all the forest that is present in this area. Okay. And basically then after some time, they basically measured what all the different things in like, for example, pH and iron concentration in all these watersheds after like um, at regular intervals of months and all. So what we see here is that once deforestation is there, so for watershed 2, which is deforested, so these two are intact, not deforested. So across years, what happens, the pH of the watershed kind of decreases. So the water becomes more and more acidic compared to other watersheds where there was no deforestation. Right. And other changes that we see are like, so for example, here they're comparing watershed 2, which was deforested, to watershed 6, which is not deforested. So here again, they are seeing that the concentration of different mm, ions, such as nitrate and uh, sulfate and all that, are kind of changing. So for watershed 2, the amount of nitrate, so this arrow demarcates where the deforestation event happened. So till then, both of them are very similar. And after that, what happens in watershed 2, the amount of nitrate that is found increases quite a lot of time. So initially, let's say it was somewhere around 1 or 2 uh, milligrams per liter. But now in watershed 2, after deforestation, it's somewhere around 60 milligrams per liter, right? Which is quite a high rise. And similarly for sulfate, in watershed 2, the amount of sulfate decreases, whereas the amount of sulfate remains constant in watershed 6, where there was no deforestation carried out. So basically, this tells us that these ion concentrations, and probably because of changes in the ion concentrations, the pH of the water is also changing. So basically, the amount of different nutrients that might be present in the water nearby to an area that cut off or the deforestation is carried out might also fluctuate and change because of the effects of the deforestation. And basically, this warns us about and helps us see how we affect these different biogeochemical cycles, and we can get a better look at what we are doing to change them and how we can probably find solutions or mitigate these things and adapt what we are doing. Right. So, yeah, that's it for today. Does anyone have any questions? Okay, criteria for essential elements. 1 second. So basically, essential elements have 3 criteria. So the first is in the absence of the element, the plant should be unable to complete their life cycle because otherwise this element is not essential if the plant does not need it to complete their life cycle, right? The second is the deficiency of an essential element cannot be met by supplying some other element. So it is essential because it does not have a replacement or any other element that can carry out the task that is carried out by this, right? And the third point is the element must be directly involved in the metabolism of the plant. So basically, the element needs to be directly involved in the metabolism for it to be an essential element. Is that clear? It's carbon released to the atmosphere by the process of weathering. Mm, Weathering is the process by which carbon is. Look, can you guys hear me? Sorry, my internet went out. Hello? Okay. So, weathering is basically a process in which carbon moves from the atmosphere to the lithosphere. So, basically, from carbon that is present in the air to carbon that is present in rocks. So, basically, atmospheric carbon, so carbon that is present in the atmosphere, is 1 second. Yeah, I can see now. So carbon that is present in the atmosphere basically combines with water during rain to form carbonic acid. So basically CO2 plus H2O, H2H2, CO3, right? Mm, that falls on the surface during rain. So basically this is present in the atmosphere. This is from rain, and thus basically this thing precipitates down. Okay. Uh, this basically falls onto rocks and is basically then absorbed into rocks or like into sediments that are present in the ocean. Right. So that's how it goes from the atmosphere to the lithosphere. So weathering is basically how it converts from a gas to rocks. This is then sedimented in ocean or goes into rocks. Okay. Does anyone else have any questions? Okay. Does anyone? Okay, please elaborate the release through tectonic process. Okay. So tectonic process is basically how carbon goes from the rocks or the lithosphere into the atmosphere. So basically what happens is that so we have these like different what do you say tectonic plates that are present in the earth, right? So basically there are these different what do you say uh, what do you say basically like there are these different parts of the crust of the earth that are basically uh, present as different separate plates, which are generally moving due to the movement of the magma that is present inside the earth. So as these plates move, so what happens is when two plates are moving away from each other, what might happen is basically there might be a gap that is forming where basically magma is rising. So we might have like things such as what do you say? Mid ocean ridges or like basically what do you say separations in between the ocean. So what happens here is basically some amount of carbon dioxide and all that might be present in the magma. This rises along with the magma to the crust of the earth, and it is then exposed to the earth, and that can be uh, basically exposed into the atmosphere. The other thing that might happen is that there might be, what do you say, when two plates converge, I think that's how like volcanoes are formed. So basically, volcanic eruption, which is given rise by plate tectonics or plate movements, also releases a lot of carbon dioxide along with a lot of sulfur. So that is also how it's basically going from the lithosphere into the atmosphere. So mostly in the form of carbon dioxide that is released from like volcanic activity and when like these tectonic plates move and basically some of the magma is coming to the top to form more new crust. Right. Is that okay? Yeah. Does anyone else have any questions? Okay. So just to okay, is someone typing? Okay. So just to reiterate what all we talked about today, we first talked about food chain. We talked about different definitions of organisms present in the food chain, different classifications such as heterotrophs versus autotrophs. What are different kinds of autotrophs such as photoautotrophs and chemoautotrophs. We talked about producers, consumers, types of consumers, herbivores, carnivores, omnivores, decomposers. We talked about different kinds of food chain, the detritus food chain, the grazing food chain, two kinds of facing food chain, which is the predator and the parasite food chain. So in the predator food chain, as you move up trophic levels, generally the size of the organism keeps on increasing. Whereas in the case of parasitic food chain, as you move up the trophic level, the size of organism keeps on decreasing. Then we talked about food webs and trophic levels in detail. We talked about ecological pyramids or trophic pyramids. We talked about the pyramids of numbers, the inverted pyramids of numbers, the spindle pyramid of numbers, which has tapering ends at both top and bottom, but the middle layer is contains the most number of organisms. We have the dumbbell-shaped pyramid of numbers, pyramid of energy, where 10% of the energy is passed on to the next trophic level. We talked about the pyramid of biomass, the inverted pyramid of biomass found in marine ecosystems, and we talked about ecological efficiency and other factors that are used to calculate ecological efficiency, such as exploitation efficiency, assimilation efficiency, gross production efficiency, and net production efficiency. We talked about the 10% rule in detail, how we can calculate the amount of energy at a given traffic level N. We talked about traffic cascades, where basically, which are ecological pyramids, where by the addition or removal of top predators and by inducing reciprocal changes in relative populations of predator and prey through the food chain, we might have dramatic changes in the ecosystem structure and nutrient cycling. We talked about primary production and what is the importance of primary production, how we measure primary production, what is the different measures methods to measure, what is efficiency of production, what is productivity, how we calculate the productivity by different methods using satellite data and by modeling, what all factors does productivity depend on. We talked about different kinds of lakes based on the productivity, such as oligotrophic lakes, mesotrophic, eutrophic, and hypertrophic lakes, hypereutrophic lakes. We talked about the Secchi depth and how we measure that in different kinds of lakes. We talked about what are the sources of nutrients in oceans and in lakes and water bodies. We talked about how we can use these knowledge that we have about all these different ecosystem variables to engineer ecosystems to work in or to accomplish some tasks that we want to do, such as prevent algal blooms or basically increase carbon dioxide absorption by the ocean. We talked about nutrients and different kinds of nutrients like micronutrients, micronutrients. We talked about what are some essential elements and the criteria that make them essential to plants. We talked about what are the roles of some essential elements in plants. We talked about macronutrients and micronutrients that are taken up by plants. We talked about biogeochemical cycles, like the nitrogen cycle, where we talked about nitrogen fixation by various means such as biological nitrogen fixation, ammonification, nitrification, and industrial nitrogen fixation. We talked about the carbon cycle. We talked about water cycle and phosphorus and sulfur cycle, which basically tell us how these elements are recycled and basically go through the different parts of the earth, such as the lithosphere, atmosphere, hydrosphere, and biosphere. We talked about how human interventions impact nutrient cycling and lead to changes in flow of streams and changes in pH and iron concentration uh, in different areas. And yeah, so that's it. And if no one has any questions, we'll stop here today. If you have any question, please feel free to ask. Okay, please, you can also unmute yourself and ask the question. No need to type the whole thing. Okay, so we'll stop here. We'll continue in the next class. Thank you for attending. If anyone has any more questions, I'm here for the next 5 minutes.